Hello and welcome. My name is Milk. This is my first vlog where I'm gonna walk you through how I paint my paintings. It'll be a rough walkthrough because I'll probably get distracted, but let's go. I paint all of my paintings with gouache for the most part, and I draw all of my sketches onto the paper that I'm going to paint on just with those Colorise pencils. I like that I can erase them because I don't normally draw thumbnails for a lot of these paintings. A lot of them are small, like this one's a 5x7, and I will just come up with an idea of like the prompt or the subject matter I want to paint. Like in this case, I thought, I want to paint a beach witch. What's a beach witch look like? And then I just drew it. The paper that I'm using is that Strathmore mixed media paper, the 400 series. I don't like texture on my paper. I like a really smooth surface to paint on. So I normally use that paper, especially because it's cheaper. So I can buy a really big pad of it and then cut it up myself with just an X-Acto knife and a ruler. But I do also really love hot press watercolor paper. And I believe it's Strathmore, it might be a different company, sells them already cut into 5x7s or 8x10s, and they're like $4 a pad on Dick Blick. So I buy a lot of those too. The reason I don't like texture is entirely a personal preference. There's nothing wrong with painting on textured watercolor paper. In fact, most people prefer it. I just am a weirdo and I don't. For all of these paintings, they have similar color schemes, mostly because I have these 3 palettes. At the very end of the video, you'll see the table that I was painting on and you'll be able to see them. But those 3 palettes have not been washed in, like, ever. I believe it's been like 8 years now. Yeah, about 8 years now since I have washed them in any capacity. So I just re-wet those constantly and add fresh paint to them. To keep things from getting muddy, I use a lot of white. That's the one thing that I think is really key when it comes to gouache, is you use white as like almost like a medium to blend with. At least I do. For example, for a lot of paintings, because I don't really use black, I'll use the opposite color on the color wheel to shade with. And I'll just mix like a tiny bit of white in there, because if I don't do that, it sometimes looks muddy. Like the white has more body in it for how opaque I want the colors to be. I should explain that I am self-taught, so if anyone has any more great tips on how to use gouache, they should totally comment them. Gouache sort of came to me in that I never knew what it was, and then my animation illustration teacher told me I should try it after watching how I paint with watercolor, because I was using watercolor in this very thick way with very little water. The only paint that I was really taught how to paint with was when I took a painting 1 class, and you were told to pick between acrylic and oil paint, and I knew from high school that I was very bad with acrylic paint, so I used oil paint. And I do love oil paint. I'm always super impressed when I see people who paint with oil paint, but for me and what I paint, I just don't plan on using it really ever again. It's very toxic, and you need well ventilated rooms to paint in when you paint with it. And where I live, it snows like half the year, so I can't paint outside with it, and I have yet to live in an apartment with particularly good ventilation for painting with oils. But they are wonderful. And the thing that I really love about gouache that I guess is comparable to oil is that while oils take a long time to dry, so you can mix on the canvas, gouache re-wets still on the paper. So I can slightly re-wet the paper as I'm painting to blend with it still on the paper. I love blending just directly onto the paper more than on the palette and then moving it over, just because that's how I was taught to paint. So that's just kind of how I've always done it and how I prefer to do it. I really do paint in a pretty basic way, to be honest. I always paint background to foreground, broad strokes to details. The faster the white is gone, the happier I tend to be with a painting, especially because for me, I think a white canvas can be very intimidating. And I don't like having to paint around something and have to worry about messing it up. Like, if I'm painting around a still white spot that's supposed to be that little fish, if I nick that white spot, it's okay. I can fix it when I paint the fish. But if I'd already painted the fish and I'm painting the cat around it, it's much harder to paint that cat freely with the right textures and brush strokes for me. It's just easier to fix your mistakes when you paint that way, because you're building up to the things that are more difficult, the things that are important, the details. And then once you finally get to them, they're much easier to do because you've already done all this work beforehand. This painting was one that I did not plan very well, I should admit. So you're gonna see me add some grass here shortly because I noticed the composition was off. I always want your eye to go, normally it's gonna go naturally anyways to the face, and then I don't want your eye to leave the page. I don't want you to go see her face and then follow her hat and go off the page. So to fix that, I ended up adding some grass behind her so that the idea would be that you would look at her face and then follow her hat and then touch the grass, and it would go, make your eye curve towards that water, and then your eye would go down the water and then up her legs and then back to her face again to try to keep your eye in the painting. For a lot of my paintings too, because I only use these really tiny brushes for no apparent reason other than I'm a crazy person, I have these ones that I've had for years, and the ones that I've had for years are the ones that I use for texture like this, because they're already destroyed from years of use. And then I have some nicer ones that I mark that I only use for inking, which you'll see later. For this, I wasn't really entirely sure how to make sand look interesting or how to make it look like sand. So I ended up doing just so many little dots and little textures. I ended up making the rockiest beach ever. Like, I wouldn't go to this beach, it's very rocky, but it is covered with seashells. I did have a lot of moments of not knowing what seashells looked like during this painting too. Like, as I was sitting there, the only thing that came to mind were the way that the seashells look in Animal Crossing, and that was totally not what seashells look like in real life. So I did have to stop and actually look at some reference photos to get my head to where I wanted them to be and really think about it. I don't think there is anything wrong with walking away from a painting and then coming back to it. I know a lot of people like power through a lot and like will keep painting and painting and painting, and that's great. But for me, I'd rather walk away and clear my head and come back to it in like a half an hour than like power through and get mad at it. Like, you'll notice that this poor hermit crab will go through a journey where I just painted him and I'm totally going to cover him in a little bit and then paint him again because I just didn't like him. I guess that's inefficient, but that's just how I paint things. It's supposed to be fun, right? I think the point where painting becomes frustrating and you get like those headaches that you get when you think about math, so you're just kind of annoyed at it, then it's no longer fun, and I'd much rather it be fun. Yep, covered the poor little guy completely up and then did it again in a little bit. So much of painting the way that my style is just a lot of little dots and a lot of little details sprinkled throughout. It was a real kind of challenge to make sure that these seashells looked like seashells, that they looked bright, or at least looked visually interesting. And then for this water, once I decided on what the background should look like, I went in with just straight white paint. It's completely undiluted white gouache to do these foam lines. As I finished up adding these white lines to it, once they're all there, I completely emptied my brush of any paint, but while they were still wet, I brought a wet brush with just water in it and pulled out that white a little bit to add a gradient. And then I used a whole lot of water to do that, and then I let it dry. So there's a little jump cut there where I let it dry entirely because I wanted that watery look. And then I went back through with just white gouache. It's always kind of hard to know when the painting is done for me because I could just keep going and going and going forever. With this one, I found out, because I filmed it, because this is the first painting I ever filmed of me, that I had painted for about 7 hours total over the course of about 3.5 days. All right, When it comes to inking is the hardest part and the easiest part at the same time, because it is the one moment where you can like make or break a painting like this. Because unlike when you're adding color, if you mess up with black, it's more of a pain to try to fix it. It's not impossible, but it is more of a pain. This is actually black wash, despite the fact that I'm calling it inking, because I've used ink. I don't actually have water-based black ink right now, but sometimes the non-water-based black inks, the Martin's one that I do have, will crack on top of the gouache, and then when I scan it into the computer later, I have to fix my little cracks with Photoshop. And then to make sure that my brush is the right thickness and the right opacity, I have a little piece of paper next to the painting, and I draw lines on that constantly. Part of it, I'm sure I don't need to, but I always get nervous about that because I want it to be perfect, and I want to know what kind of line I'm going to draw before I draw it on the actual painting. In the future, when I make these, I probably won't talk just about painting, just so you know. I have some videos coming up that I plan on releasing soon where I'm going to talk about movies, and I'm going to review movies and talk about things that I like, and probably paint some fan art. I've never painted fan art before, and I've never really made a movie poster or any of that kind of stuff. So I thought that would be a fun art journey to go on with you all. I should add a fair warning that my favorite things are horror movies and cute macabre things. So I paint a lot of dark things, but I paint them so cute that no one tells me that they're dark. So there's that. So I hope you like horror. I also hope you like fairy tales and folklore and storytelling, because those are the main things that I really enjoy, that I can't wait to talk about on this channel. It's funny, trying to talk about it out loud, I realize how short my process is when it comes to painting. I don't really have too much of an in-depth process or thought about painting. It's just a thing that I do that I've never really had to explain before. And honestly, I think it really is just all the basics. Once you have a firm grasp of just basic painting, basic background to foreground, add in your colors and then go back in with your details. It's all about just refining the style that you want to paint in, the aesthetic of the characters and backgrounds that you want to draw. And she's done. Let's peel off this tape. Alright, that's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions about how to paint with gouache, or if anyone has any tips on how to paint with gouache that I didn't say, please leave them below, and I'll see you soon. Bye!